Every team has its up and downs, but some teams have higher highs and lower lows than others. So let's take a look at each NBA team's best and worst draft pick. Now to set some ground rules. Number one, I won't be counting players who were traded on draft night. I want to see actual homegrown talent. Number two, there will be some ties. There isn't always a definite best and worst player because some teams are just that bad at drafting that I couldn't even decide who was worse. So now let's not waste any more time and get into the first team, the Atlanta Hawks. Now the Atlanta Hawks' worst pick was Sheldon Williams at number 5 in 2006. Sheldon Williams was known for being a two-way power forward out of Duke. He looked very promising, but his talent did not translate to the NBA. He played only 1 year with Atlanta and averaged 4 points and 4 rebounds in that 1 year. And only 6 years after being drafted, he would be playing in Europe. Now with their best pick, I have Al Horford at number 3. Al Horford was picked 3rd overall in 2007, the year after Williams. Horford was a great pick who spent 9 years in Atlanta, who did not bring Atlanta very far in the playoffs, but still led them to a number 1 seed a couple years. Al Horford is still a great rotational piece with the Celtics today, with his outside shooting ability and defending ability at the age of 37. Now on to our next team, my Boston Celtics. The Boston Celtics' worst pick of all time is Clarence Glover at number 10. Glover was picked 10th overall in 1971 and did pretty much nothing in his career. He played 25 games, averaged 2 points, got cut, and never played in the NBA again. Glover was okay at Western Kentucky, averaging 9 points and 11 rebounds, and none of that talent translated to the NBA whatsoever. The Celtics' best pick of all time is Larry Bird, 6th overall in 1979. The Celtics got possibly their best player of all time at 6th overall. 3 championships and helped define an era at 6th overall. That is pretty damn good. Next up, I have the Brooklyn Nets. The Nets' worst pick of all time is Ed O'Bannon at 9th overall. You may recognize his name because Ed O'Bannon is known for his class action lawsuit against the NCAA that effectively killed the NCAA football games. O'Bannon also played in the NBA and was a standout at UCLA. He played 3 seasons in the NBA, 2 of them for the Nets, and effectively did nothing. A definite waste of a top 10 pick. At their best pick, I have Bernard King at number 7. Bernard King was drafted by the Nets. I was shocked too. King is more known for being really good on the New York Knicks, but he did play for Brooklyn for 3 seasons and was actually pretty good. Was by far the best homegrown talent in Brooklyn. Next is the Charlotte Hornets, and their best player ever drafted was Alonzo Mourning. Alonzo Mourning was picked at number 2 overall, ended up becoming a standout center for the majority of his career. A 7-time All-Star and Hall of Famer is not bad for number 2. Mourning did have most of his success in Miami, but still a great pick. And now, the first tie of the video with the Hornets' worst picks. I have Frank Kaminsky at number 9, Cody Zeller at number 4, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist at number 2, Adam Morrison at number 3, and Emeka Okafor at number 2. I could not pick one. They were all so bad. Do better, Charlotte. Next up is the Chicago Bulls, and their best pick was Michael Jordan at number 3 in 1984. Now, Jordan is, in my opinion, the best player in the NBA and defined the 90s NBA. The Bulls managed to get him with the 3rd overall pick. Not too shabby, Chicago. And their worst player was Stacey King, selected at number 6. King was a standout at Oklahoma and picked 6th overall in the 1989 draft and was neither good nor healthy. And when he was healthy, he was terrible. Very shabby, Chicago. Try saying that 3 times fast. And some honorable mentions, I have Ben Gordon and Jay Williams. Next up, I have the Cleveland Cavaliers, and their best pick was LeBron James at number 1 in 2003. I know he was the number 1 pick, but LeBron could be the best player of all time. So you still get the best pick in Cavs history for that. Some honorable mentions, I have Kyrie Irving and Hot Rod Williams. Their worst pick of all time, I have Anthony Bennett. This is a pretty obvious one here. Bennett was picked number 1 overall in the 2013 draft and was meant to pair with Kyrie Irving. Obviously, Bennett was trash and was sent to the Timberwolves in the Kevin Love trade. And Anthony Bennett had no other significance other than being one of the biggest busts of all time. Next up, I have the Dallas Mavericks, and their best pick was Jalen Brunson. And this one I'm going to give more for value, as I will most of the other teams on this list. But for where they picked them, Brunson was an absolute gem. For an honorable mention, I have Jason Kidd. And the worst Timberwolves player ever picked was Bill Garnett, selected 4th overall in 1982. The Wyoming small forward almost did nothing in his career, playing 4 years in the NBA before going off to play in Italy. May I remind you, he was the 4th overall pick and played 4 years in the NBA. Garnett has to be one of the worst players on this list because he barely played in the NBA and did nothing. Next up, I have the Denver Nuggets, and their best pick is Nikola Jokic. What else did you think I was going to say? Nikola Jokic is the biggest steal of all time. With the 41st overall pick, the Nuggets got a generational player who led them to their first championship with the 41st pick. For the Nuggets' worst pick is a guy who has a very hard to pronounce name, but I'm going to try my best. Nicolas Tiskishvili. I'm not going to try pronouncing his name again. So to keep it short, he played for 4 teams in 4 years, and then went right back to Europe. Great for a top 5 pick, Denver. Next up is the Detroit Pistons, and their best pick was Joe Dumars. He was selected 18th overall in 1985. A Hall of Fame, 6-time All-Star, and 5-time All-Defensive team is not bad for the 18th pick. I would put Isaiah Thomas ahead of Joe Dumars all time, but for where they got Dumars, I have to put Joe Dumars ahead. Getting a player on his level for a mid-first round pick is incredible. For honorable mentions, I have Andre Drummond, Chris Middleton, Isaiah Thomas, and Dennis Rodman. For the Pistons' worst overall pick, you should know this, it's Darko Milicic. Darko was selected 2nd overall in 2003. Yes, the same draft where LeBron was picked before him, and Carmelo Anthony, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade were picked after him. I want to say I'm surprised, Denver, but I'm not. He's the reason your franchise was so relevant after you won the championship in 2004. Next up, I have the Golden State Warriors. And this one's pretty obvious. It's Steph Curry, picked 9th overall in 2009. Curry is the obvious choice just because of how dominant he was during the Warriors dynasty. A 4-time champ, 2-time MVP, and the leader in career 3-pointers at 9th overall. One of the biggest steals in NBA history, even though he was picked top 10. For the Warriors' worst pick, I have Chris Washburn, who was picked 3rd overall in 1986. Washburn played 72 games in the NBA and averaged 3 points. A top 3 pick who didn't even play a half of any of the seasons he played in the NFL is pretty crap if you ask me. I just said the NFL. A top 3 pick who didn't even play half a season and was crap when he did play is pretty bad for a 3rd overall pick. Next up is the Houston Rockets, and their best pick is Hakeem Olajuwon, who was picked number 1 overall in 1984. While he was picked over MJ, Hakeem was still a great player throughout the 80s and 90s and brought the Rockets 2 championships. Was the number 1 overall pick, but still a great pick from Houston. And the Rockets' worst pick was John Lucas, selected number 1 overall in 1976. The Rockets absolutely blundered on this pick. Lucas was alright for some years, but was nowhere near number 1 overall pick material. Next up is the Indiana Pacers, and I have their best player being Paul George, selected number 10 overall in 2010. A 8-time All-Star, 4-time All-Defense, and 6-time All-NBA at 10th overall is pretty good. Keep in mind, Paul George is going to be a future Hall of Famer who kept LeBron on his toes for a couple years. Pretty good pick, Indy. And for honorable mentions, I have Danny Granger and Reggie Miller. And the Pacers' worst pick was Rick Roby, who was picked 3rd overall in 1978. Roby was a standout center at Kentucky, and because of that, the Pacers picked him number 3 overall in 1978. Roby spent a half a year in Indy before going to Boston and was eventually sent to the Suns for Dennis Johnson. At least the Pacers dumped him before the rest of the NBA knew he was trash. Next up is the Indiana Pacers, and their best pick was Adrian Dantley, number 6 overall in the 1976 NBA draft. The Clippers had a lot of terrible picks, but Dantley is a light at the end of the tunnel that they traded after he won Rookie of the Year. Dantley went on to make 6 All-Star games, 2 All-NBA teams, one of the best scorers of the 80s and 90s. Not a bad pick. Just a shame you traded him. But honestly, what else do we expect from the Clippers? And their worst pick. Oh boy, there was a lot of them. But their worst pick was Michael Olowokandi, selected number 1 overall in 1998. Olowokandi was picked because he was 7'6" and had potential. He was extremely raw and never grew out of it. Waste of a number 1 overall pick. For honorable mentions, I have Al-Farouq Amino, Sean Livingston, and Danny Ferry. Next up is the Lakers, and they have had a lot of good picks throughout the years. But their best pick, in my opinion, was Magic Johnson at number 1 overall in 1979. It's Magic. What else do you need me to tell you? Some honorable mentions are Brandon Ingram, Julius Randle, and Vlade Divac. No, I'm not counting Kobe because he was traded on draft night. The Lakers' worst draft pick of all time is Wayne Yates, selected 5th overall in 1961. Yates played 37 games in his rookie year before getting hurt, averaging 2 points a game in the process. And after that, he joined a team in the American Basketball League, which disbanded. It was hard to find a bad Lakers pick, but this one was really bad. Next up is the Grizzlies, and I have Kyle Lowry at number 24 overall in 2006. Yes, the Grizzlies' draft history hasn't been that great. Kyle Lowry would only spend 2 seasons in Memphis before going to Houston and eventually Toronto, where he ended up being really good. He didn't do anything significant in Memphis, but was still a really good pick at number 24. For their worst pick, I have Hasheem Thabeet, who was selected number 2 overall in 2009. Thabeet is one of the worst busts in NBA history. He averaged 2 points, 2 rebounds, and about a block a game. Seriously, Memphis, how did you screw up this badly? Next up is the Miami Heat, and I have their best draft pick as Dwayne Wade, who was selected number 5 overall in 2003. I know this draft was stacked, and it was kind of hard to go wrong, but Dwayne Wade is still a generational scorer who was a key piece in 3 championship teams. Great value for the 5th pick. For Miami's worst pick, I have Michael Beasley, selected 2nd overall in 2008. Now, Beasley actually wasn't that bad. Miami's been pretty good drafting over the years. However, considering Beasley was a pretty average player, picking him at number 2 was still pretty bad. Next, I have the Bucks and their best. It's Giannis. You know Giannis is the best player. For a mid-first round pick, the Bucks got a physical freak who led them to their first championship since the 70s. And honestly, Giannis is probably going to be one of the best players of all time when he retires, and most likely the best player in Bucks history. Giannis proved that having a mid-first round pick doesn't mean you should just pick whoever, because there is talent out there. And for an honorable mention, I have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, selected number 1 overall in 1979. For their worst pick, I have Kent Benson, selected number 1 overall in 1977. You thought I was going to say Andrew Bogut or Jabari Parker, right? Well, no, Benson was much worse. Benson was the number 1 overall pick in 1977 and put up below average numbers pretty much his whole career. He was a college great who just never translated to the NBA. Next up is the Timberwolves, and I have their best pick as Kevin Garnett, selected 5th overall in the 1995 draft. Minnesota hasn't made great draft choices throughout the years, but Garnett is definitely an amazing pick. Garnett would become a superstar in the 2000s and somewhat of a star in the early 2010s. He won a championship in Boston and was very close to winning Minnesota a championship. Great value for the 5th pick. And for some honorable mentions, I have Zach LaVine and Wally Skurczybek. And the Timberwolves' worst pick was Derek Williams, selected 2nd overall in 2011. Williams played 6 years in the NBA, averaging about 9 points and 4 rebounds. Not the worst bust, but really bad for the 2nd overall pick. Next up is the Pelicans, and I have their best pick being Chris Paul. Chris Paul was selected 4th overall in 2005. Chris Paul would end up being one of the best playmakers of all time who didn't bring anything to New Orleans, but would become known as the point god. Great value for the 4th pick. Pelicans' worst pick is Austin Rivers at number 10 in 2012. There aren't many choices, so Austin Rivers is mine. By no means is Rivers terrible, just a journeyman who never played a significant role in any team. Not great for a top 10 pick. Next up is the New York Knicks, and I have their best pick being Patrick Ewing, selected 1st overall in 1985. Ewing is one of the best big men of all time. Yes, he was picked 1st overall, but still a great hit who never led the Knicks to a chip, but led the Knicks to a lot of great teams in the 90s that rivaled Jordan's Bulls. And my worst Knicks pick is Gene Short, selected 9th overall in 1975. Short was a top 10 pick who played 34 games in the NBA and averaged 2 points. Could not find why he stopped playing basketball because his Wikipedia page is about a paragraph long and doesn't even mention it. Still, rest in peace. Next up is the OKC Thunder, with their best pick being Kevin Durant, selected 2nd overall in 2007. A 13-time All-Star, 6-time first-team All-NBA, a 2-time Finals MVP, and a MVP. Yes, it's the 2nd overall pick, but yes, it's Kevin Durant. The Thunder's worst pick was James Bailey, selected 6th overall in 1979. Rutgers was just a below-average player who played only 11 years in the NBA, but still not worth a 6th overall pick. Next up, I have the Orlando Magic, and their best pick is Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq was selected 1st overall in 1992 and almost single-handedly brought up the Magic franchise from irrelevancy. Shaq would see most of his successes outside of Orlando, but a 15-time All-Star, 8-team first-team All-NBA, and a first-ballot Hall of Famer is still pretty good. The Magic's worst pick, I have Mo Bamba, selected 6th overall in 2018. Probably one of the most recent players on this list, Bamba was selected 6th overall in 2018, and he never really became anything. Bamba is far from the worst player on this list, but is just a below average role player who is now sitting on the 76ers bench. And speaking of the 76ers, they're up next, and their best pick of all time is Joel Embiid, 3rd overall in 2014. While Joel Embiid missed the first 2 seasons of his career, he would flourish into a star. And he's led the 76ers closest they've been to a championship since the 80s. I mean, if you don't count the 2001 finals run, but the 76ers never really had a chance in that. The face of the franchise for the 3rd overall pick is still pretty good. Now we have another tie because the 76ers have been just that bad at drafting. Now I have Markelle Fultz selected number 1 overall in 2017, Ben Simmons selected number 1 overall in 2016, Jahlil Okafor selected 3rd overall in 2015, Evan Turner selected number 2 overall in 2010, and Sean Bradley selected number 2 overall in 1993. You could make a mural with all the terrible 76ers picks throughout the years. Ben Simmons did have some good years with the 76ers, and they got James Harden out of him, so I can see how you might exclude him from this list. But considering now he's a bench player who is definitely not worth a 1st overall selection. Next up, I have the Phoenix Suns, and it's Steve Nash at number 15 in 1996. Nash was a mid-first round selection who ended up being one of the best playmakers of all time. A 2-time MVP, 8-time All-Star, and 3-time first-team All-NBA is pretty good for the 15th overall pick. Now, I almost gave another tie to the Suns, but I found William Bedford selected 6th overall in 1986. The Suns have had a pretty bad history, but Bedford sticks out among the rest. I hesitate to put Bedford on the list because he struggled with drugs for most of his career, but he was still really bad when he was on the court. 4 points and 2 rebounds a game is pretty bad for the 6th overall pick. Next up, I have the Portland Trailblazers with Clyde Drexler, 14th overall in the 1983 draft. While I love Dame, I think Clyde is just better, and Clyde was also selected lower in the draft. A 10-time All-Star, a 5-time first-team All-NBA, a 5-time All-NBA, and Hall of Famer is pretty good for the 14th overall pick. Now, I'm going to give just a 2-way tie here to Greg Oden, picked 1st overall in 2007, and Sam Bowie selected 2nd overall in 1984. Greg Oden was picked 1st overall over Kevin Durant and had an injury-riddled career that just kind of fizzled out. And Sam Bowie was selected 2nd overall in the 1984 draft over Michael Jordan. The Blazers were looking for their first solid big man since Bill Walton and ended up getting a worse version of Jusuf Nurkic. And keep in mind, Blazers fans, you missed out on the opportunity to draft Michael Jordan. Next up, I have the Sacramento Kings with a bit of a surprise here. I have Nate Tiny Archibald selected in the 2nd round, 19th overall in the 1971 draft. I know this is a weird choice, but Nate Archibald had a pretty good career. In 1972, Archibald led the NBA in points per game with 34 and assists per game with 11. After Archibald was done in Kansas City, which is where the Kings played before Sacramento, he went off to Boston. And he actually had some solid years there while winning a championship in 1981. A 6-time All-Star, a 3-time first-team All-NBA, and a Hall of Famer is pretty damn good for the 2nd round. Next up, I have the Kings, who I also almost gave a tie to, until I found Ken Durrett, who was selected 4th overall in 1971. Durrett had a terrible 4-year career, averaging 4 points a game and 2 rebounds a game. He did very little in his career, but did die of a heart attack at the age of 52. Rest in peace. Next up, I have the Spurs, who have had a very good drafting history, but I'm giving their best pick to Tony Parker. Parker was selected 28th overall in 2001. Parker is not the best player the Suns drafted, but they got him at the best value. A 6-time All-Star, 4-time All-NBA, and a Finals MVP at 20th overall is pretty solid. Now, of course, I have to mention the honorable mentions, Tim Duncan, David Robinson, and Manu Ginobili. For the Spurs' worst pick, I have Johnny Dawkins, selected 10th overall in 1986. It was hard to find a bad pick, and Johnny Dawkins actually was not bad, but far from good. 10 points and 5 assists a game is, again, not bad, but not worth a 10th overall pick. Honestly, great drafting from San Antonio. Next up, I have the Toronto Raptors, and their best pick of all time is Tracy McGrady at number 9 in 1997. McGrady was a generational scorer, mostly out of Toronto, but still a Hall of Famer who could score from anywhere. Great pick, Toronto. Now, I didn't have a lot of picks to go off of considering the Raptors are a pretty new franchise, so their worst pick is Marcus Camby at number 2 in 1996. Camby could rebound well, but couldn't really do much else. Not the best for a 2nd overall pick. Again, could have done a lot worse, but because of their draft history, I can't really find a player who was much worse. At the Jazz best pick, I actually have a two-way tie with Karl Malone and John Stockton. Karl Malone and John Stockton led the Jazz to greatness in the 90s, including 2 NBA Finals appearances, both of them which they lost, but still both had pretty great careers, and pretty much all their years were spent in Utah. And with their worst pick, I have Dante Exum at number 5, selected in 2014. The Jazz used a top 5 pick on Exum and quickly regretted it. Exum played 7 years in the NBA and averaged 5 points a game with 30% three-point shooting. Honestly, one of the worst picks of the last decade. And for our final team, I have the Washington Wizards. The Wizards have actually had a lot of good picks, but I'm taking Walt Bellamy as my best pick, who was selected number 1 overall in 1961. You've probably never heard of Walt Bellamy, but he was one of the best centers of the 60s. In his rookie season, he averaged 31 points a game and 20 rebounds. That is insane. I know it's the 60s, but holy crap. His stats decreased as his career went on, but still a great pick from the Wizards. And for the Wizards' worst pick, this was pretty easy. Kwame Brown, who was selected number 1 overall in 2001. Brown was a below average forward who was selected number 1 overall and definitely was not worth it. He averaged 6 points and 5 rebounds in an 11-year career that was filled with nothing. Well, that took a long time. So we got into the past a lot today, but if you want to know how the NBA is going to look like this season, go watch either of my predictions video on the East or Western Conference. This is Underground Sports. My name is Luke. This has taken me a while to record, and I hope you've had a magnificent rest of your day.